So good morning. Today we'll be doing a guided meditation using the scaffolding of the Four Noble Truths. So let me give you a little background on what the Four Noble Truths are. They're like the basis of Buddhism. So the Four Noble Truths were the first sermon preached by the Buddha to his compatriots, his peers, and it's the first sermon that the Buddha ever preached as an enlightened being. The Four Noble Truths, prior to the Buddha's enlightenment, him and the peers that he gave this sermon to practiced extreme asceticism and suffered immensely together as a result. The idea of this extreme asceticism was literally to burn away the body to free the mind. And the Buddha arrived at the conclusion at some point that that didn't work and that he needed to come up with a better plan. And so he decided to sit down by a tree and meditate and not get up from his meditation until he managed to free himself. Remembering the Buddha's primary goal throughout the entire length of his practice was singular, and that's to free himself and everybody else from suffering. And so he sat by the tree until he became free from suffering. And you could say that the Four Noble Truths are the result of that meditation experience. They're the putting into words of the experience of that meditation. And that meditation and the Four Noble Truths are actually a discovery, in the sense that the Buddha didn't invent these Four Noble Truths. While he did put them into words, he discovered them very much like Sir Isaac Newton discovered gravity. It existed, it was a natural law. And so the Buddha's discovery is the discovery of a set of natural laws. The first sermon he gave was you could say, codification of that meditation experience. The Four Noble Truths, while there's been a huge amount of philosophical commentary associated with them, are not really an intellectual matter. They're more a practice than some sort of academic scholarly discussion. They're the practice of yoga. And remember, I use yoga and meditation interchangeably as terms. So basically, the Four Noble Truths are the practice of yoga. So let's begin with looking at the structure of the Four Noble Truths. They're set up very much like the medical model that we kind of use today in order to treat diseases. The first part of a medical model is to identify the problem or the disease. In other words, to do a diagnosis. The second part of the model is to identify the cause or the etiology, the thing that makes the disease happen. The third part of the model is to figure out what the prognosis is. Some diseases are treatable and some diseases are not. And the final part of the model is the treatment plan, or the method of remedying the disease. So let's start with the first noble truth. These are really simple statements, but can be looked at much more deeply. So the first noble truth is there is suffering. In this case, suffering, the term used to describe suffering by the Buddha is dukkha, and dukkha means an out of round axle, which would cause a cart to have a unstable forward motion. Another thought is, if you happen to be a fan of the movie The Matrix, dukkha is the splinter in the mind that drives us mad. It's not something that comes and goes. In other words, you don't just suddenly suffer and then stop suffering. It's continual and ongoing. In other words, this is a chronic disease, the disease of suffering. Suffering in this case is to not be able to get rid of something you don't want, or to not be able to get something you want. Suffering is first and foremost the fact that we're going to get sick, we're going to get old, age, and eventually we're going to die. How do we deal with this kind of suffering? What's our standard operating procedure for dealing with things like loss and the idea of sickness and all those kinds of things? Well, let's look at COVID. I'm going to explore these Four Noble Truths through the example of something that's happening in our everyday lives. The word suffering could also be interchanged with the word stress, as in things that work you up and cause you to have feelings of unpleasantness, and cause you to have to figure out ways to cope with those things. Our primary mode of coping, generally speaking, is one would be denial. In other words, I'm just not going to see this. I'm going to look past it, around it. I'm going to do everything in my power to ignore it. So if you think of the things that are happening today, as a result of COVID, as a case here. So there are things that result from COVID that fit nicely into this idea of things that that we're being forced to have to endure, things that we would like to get rid of, or things that we would like to have in the place of the things that we would like to get rid of. We're faced with these things, and these things are hard for us to bear. So what we do is, one thing we do, for instance, in yoga, is to plaster over these things with positivity. We'll pretend that people aren't suffering. We'll pretend that we don't have to get rid of things, or to just ignore this, to act as if it's not actually occurring. That's happening frequently today around COVID, where you have everything from the most outlandish conspiracy theories that are designed to make the COVID disappear, to people pretending the COVID isn't a bad deal, or that it's not as bad as people try and make it out to be. And this plays out in our everyday lives. So if you, for instance, ignoring the recommendations of professionals to not, participate in family events, having parties, or having graduation events, or bringing our family together for a barbecue, or things like that, refusing to see the COVID as being dangerous, and ignoring the suffering that this COVID can be causing to us. So The first noble truth is there is suffering. There is stress. That's the disease. So, what's the cause of the disease? What, you know, when we think of the cause of a disease, uh, we have a general approach to dealing with causes. And that approach is to see the cause of the suffering that we're experiencing as being outside of ourselves, as being the result of some external force. So, for instance, the problem with COVID is we can blame the virus, we can blame the government, we can blame our neighbors, we can blame the people in Kroger's who refuse to wear a mask, we can blame the governor for imposing rules on us that go against our grain. What we do when we experience suffering and we're trying to figure out what's causing it, generally speaking, is to take that that cause and externalize it. Well, let's begin with this: that the cause is not external. The cause is internal. Now you could think of this on lots of different levels, all the way from cognitive behavioral psychology down to basic yoga philosophy. But the cause of suffering is the fact that we are addicted to our life, or addicted to what we consider to be the norm or the way that life is supposed to go. We have an idea, a picture in our mind of our life and what it's supposed to look like, and that picture is so strongly held that despite the fact that that picture is an inaccurate representation of reality, we will hold that picture in our mind against all odds. And holding that picture is, is part of the cause here, because really this starts to, look very much like an addictive process. Being addicted to something that really is unhealthy for us, or takes away the possibility of any kind of happiness occurring in our life, we are addicted to something that cannot be. So the real cause of suffering is clinging or attachment or addiction to something, to an object. So where does that object reside? Well, the object itself resides inside of our own mind. The mind is what contains the object. So let's, for just a second, let's close our eyes. And I know this goes against the grain of most guided meditations, which are intended to be sort of like opiates or tranquilizers to make us feel good. But we're going the long way there, as opposed to taking a shortcut that will inevitably fail. So let's close our eyes and just begin to think of the things in that picture that are bothering us, that are causing us to feel sensations like tension and feelings of sadness and feelings of maybe even despair. Let's identify the objects in that picture, which resides in our own mind, and begin to focus on them. What kinds of things do you see in that picture that you're attached to, that you are finding it very difficult to let go of? What are you clinging to? It might be a visit from your grandchildren not being possible. It might be not being able to go out to some sort of a social event, even going out to dinner and feeling as if you're safe. What kinds of things, or the fear of doing things that could cause COVID, doing them anyway, and then spending your time being afraid that you in some way or other have been infected. What kinds of things can you see in this picture that you're holding on to so tightly that are causing you to have feelings that result in suffering, or sensations that result in suffering? focus on those things with me for just a few minutes, a few breaths. Trying to identify the worst cases, maybe. This focus may bring about some discomfort, but just endure it. Push up the pain, or push up the will to bear the discomfort, and just look directly into the face of suffering. Maybe what really makes you afraid to let go. Maybe you're afraid your grandchildren will forget who you are. You begin to see the picture as separate, identifiable objects. So we're faced with an addiction to this picture, and maybe if we take the picture apart into its basic identifiable objects, it presents some difficulty. But paying attention to the idea that the picture and these identifiable objects are basically thoughts, ideas. So what we're talking about is something that exists completely in the mind. Thoughts are contained in the mind. And maybe associated with these thoughts are sensations. Maybe when you have these thoughts, you feel the tightening, the heat, the band around the head, the tension in the shoulders and neck. And feelings that are associated with these thoughts. Sadness, mourning, despair. Now let's move to the third noble truth. So this is sort of an optimistic part of the Four Noble Truths. This is the prognosis part. And generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, if we know the cause of a disease, there is some chance we can do something about the disease. But we know the cause. The cause is an addiction to the picture or the separate objects that result in unpleasant or undesirable feelings and sensations. We're addicted to that picture and those objects. So what does it mean to be addicted? It means we're holding on to something, holding on to it tightly. We don't want to let go of it. But remembering that these thoughts, sensations, and feelings exist entirely in the mind. So how should we see these things that we're afraid to let go of? These things that we're addicted to, this picture that we're holding on to so tight? Well, Zen Master, in a talk to his students, said something like this. He held up his favorite teacup and he said, "I love this cup. I drink tea out of it every day. But you know, I realize that it is already broken." So what's the implication there? The idea that any thought, feeling, or sensation that we're holding on to is likely to be impacted by the fact that everything is constantly changing, that our life is subject to impermanence. The things that we hold on to so tightly. So for instance, the picture of our grandchildren being, that we're being afraid that they'll forget who we are because we can't make contact with them in the way that we think we should, in the way that our picture says that we should be able to. So this picture itself, while we hold it in our mind as a permanent item or permanent object, in reality is not permanent. These grandchildren are constantly changing, growing, maturing, being able to see things in their lives that they never were able to see before, developing the capacity for compassion and empathy. They're not going to be the same objects as you have in the picture that you're addicted to. Everything is impermanent. And if we begin to think in terms of impermanence, if we begin to recognize that even though this is our favorite cup, that it's already broken, we're taking one step to being able to more easily let go of things that we're addicted to or feel that have to absolutely be the way they are in order for us to feel happiness or be okay with our lives. Next thing is to think in terms of, how do I hold on to things? Maybe I can't imagine, even on the level of thoughts inside of my own mind, I can't imagine obliterating the object of my grandchildren and wiping it from consciousness. But do we really have to? So imagine that you're holding on to a rope, a thick, coarse hemp rope, and you've got both hands wrapped around it as tightly as you can possibly hold on to it. You're holding on for dear life. And then suddenly, some force, some powerful force just whips that rope from your hands. The result is likely to be rope burns or maybe even bloody abrasions. Now suppose that we take that rope between our finger and thumb and we hold on to it. We hold on to it lightly because we're aware of the fact of impermanence. We know that at any moment in time that rope can be pulled away. But by holding it between our forefinger and thumb, holding it lightly with the knowledge of its impermanence, when the rope is pulled away, no blood, no foul. We aren't injured. We're able to let go. So the third noble truth is, since we know that the cause of suffering is our addiction, our unwillingness to let go, learning that things are impermanent, learning that things can be held lightly so that we're more easily able to let go of them, is a step towards freeing ourselves from suffering. Now, what I'm describing here is not really that easy to accomplish. In other words, allowing the idea of impermanence to come so much into us that it's part of our heart, and the willingness to hold lightly onto things with the recognition that we'll have to let go of them. Also, the recognition that these things, in reality, exist inside of our own mind. We hold a picture, for instance, let's use the example of our grandchildren, that's unrealistic. We hold a picture inside of our mind that's permanent and has to be the way it is, when in fact the reality of our grandchildren is subject to change and impermanence, growth. So we need to use these three tactics. A recognition of the fact that the picture that we hold in our mind represents what's going on outside. It's a facsimile, but it doesn't do a very good job of representing it in terms of the impermanence of the reality. Next, we need to realize that impermanence means that things are going to change. The things we love may turn out to be the things we don't care for so much at some point in the future. The things we hate, we may discover when you flip them around, are actually things that we feel closer to. A willingness to embrace the idea of impermanence, embrace the idea that what causes suffering is inside of our own minds. And again, these are not easy things to embrace. So the last of the noble truths is a yoga path. A path that the Buddha recommends, tells his followers in this first sermon, the Sermon of the Four Truths, is the way to end suffering. The first of the noble, the eightfold path that is part of the fourth noble truth is right understanding. And of course, right understanding, well, there can be lots of things that means. Right understanding means those two primary things. Everything exists inside of your own mind, and everything is subject to impermanence. So for a few minutes, let's just focus on one of those objects that we identified in the first part of this talk. For instance, the example of not being able to be with your grandchildren and being afraid that they'll grow up not knowing who you are. Picking one of those things and then subjecting that object, whatever it is that you've chosen, to the idea of impermanence. How will that person change? What kinds of things are you likely to see if you let go of the picture that you're addicted to? Who is your grandchild from your grandchild's own side, as opposed to your grandchild from inside of your own mind? Maybe imagine them growing and maturing and gaining empathy and compassion and understanding. Imagine yourself letting go of that part of the picture that you're addicted to, just seeing it be released. Seeing it not comporting to what your grandchild is like from the other side. Letting go of the fear. The next step on the Eightfold Path is a willingness to make the effort, a willingness to practice yoga, a willingness to take the steps necessary to free yourself from suffering and stress. Are you willing? Will you do the work? The Buddha way has been described as the middle way, the way between the extremes of asceticism and the extremes of hedonism. To get caught up in believing that life is about the pursuit of pleasure and comfort, the hedonistic side, or that in order to accomplish anything useful, you have to suffer in order to accomplish it. This is often the case with people who believe that yoga requires that you're always doing things that are extreme and pushing yourself to the edge. Part of the Buddha's steps include mindfulness and meditation, or right concentration. Are you willing to practice? Practice mindfulness in your everyday affairs. First, being mindful of the impermanence of the things that you are beginning to become attached to. Being mindful as in the Zen Master's cup, knowing that whatever it is that you're beginning to become attached to is already broken. Being mindful of how you hold the rope. And maybe achieving a level of meditation that makes it possible for you to sit and let go and free yourself. Free yourself from the picture that you're addicted to, that you hold in your mind. So we're going to do a basic guided meditation practice, seeing if we can't integrate the things that we've discussed today. And the practice is going to be based on the prayer, may all beings be peaceful, may all beings be happy, may all beings be safe, may all beings awaken to their true nature, may all beings be free. So first, I want you to picture something that you're attached to, something that you hold on to, and that you're having a real hard time letting go of. Because of this struggle, you suffer, and you're unable to obtain the first phrase in the prayer. You can't find any peace. I want you to imagine yourself letting go of that thing that you're attached to, knowing that it's impermanent, already broken. Or if you're holding on to it at all, holding it lightly, maybe even letting it just sit in the palm of your hand so that the lightest breeze could blow it away. Picture that thing being released. Second phrase in the prayer, may all beings be happy. What's it mean to be happy? Our natural tendency is to strive for the things that make us feel good, that are pleasant, the pleasures that we can get in our way, or to avoid the things that make us, that we feel are unpleasant or causes discomfort. Looking for gratification. Maybe pretending things are what they're not. Glossing over things with positivity. What is it to be happy? Sometimes I think being happy would be like wearing a heavy, wet wool coat all the time, day and night. Your body underneath would be so hot and sweaty, but you're afraid to take the coat off. You're afraid you'll be exposed. And finally, because you're working the path, you're doing yoga, you decide to unbutton the coat a little, and a tiny breeze seeps into your skin. And it feels good. That motivates you to continue to follow the path, and as you do, more and more of the coat becomes unbuttoned until finally you're able to set it aside and be free from the addictions, the picture that you can only see from your own side, the cool, fresh air on your skin. Maybe that's what it's like to be happy, unencumbered. Next phrase is, may all beings be safe. What's it mean to be safe? How can we be safe if the picture we're addicted to is a poor representation of what's real? If we're busily glossing over with positivity, believing that, for instance, we can go to that party or that barbecue because all this COVID stuff is just nonsense. How can we be safe if our picture that we're addicted to and the reality that is on, not in our own minds, don't comport with each other? How can we know what's true if we're in denial about the truth? Awakening to your true nature. What is your true nature? Is it your true nature to wear the heavy coat, to hold on to the rope with both hands, to believe the cup will never be taken away from you? Is that your true nature? Or is it your true nature to be free? Free from the addiction. And so the last phrase, may all beings be free, remembering the Buddha's goal from the very beginning of his striving for a path, his attempt to find enlightenment, was to free himself and everybody from suffering. It wasn't about the pursuit of pleasure or the escape from the difficult things, but to be free from suffering, which means to be free from the addiction, which means to know that everything is impermanent. And that suffering is the result of the thought objects, feeling objects, sensation objects that exist in your own mind. Freedom requires restraint, because without restraint, there can be no freedom. So bringing ourselves back to the moment, just beginning to release. Maybe bringing your hands behind your back and opening your heart with a little bit of a back bend. Raising our arms up alongside of our ears. Exhaling our hands to prayer. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be happy. May all beings be safe. May all beings awaken to their divine nature. May all beings be free. Thank you for practicing yoga with me today. Namaste. And we'll end this here today. And you'll probably find this on Facebook pretty soon. Or excuse me, on YouTube.